Welcome to ACI Learning's Leadership Series. I'm Sophie Goodwin, and today we're going to be talking about the things you need to think about when it comes to purchasing and implementing new technology, how to spend wisely, and how cyber leaders can take full advantage of the tech they might already have. And to help us do that is Dr. Gerry Auger of Simply Cyber. Gerald, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Super pumped to be here. Thanks, Sophie.
I think it's going to be a really fun conversation, and I'm really interested to learn a little bit more about this because I think we do see a lot of times cyber leaders maybe jump the gun a little bit. There's shiny new tech out there that they want to take advantage of. They purchase it and then realize maybe they don't need it. Why do you think we see this happening?
Yeah, unfortunately, it happens all the time because a lot of times it becomes easy to stroke a check and feel like you can solve a problem very quickly by purchasing a solution that you've been told can solve that problem. Unfortunately, that's an easy button, but it doesn't always solve necessarily the problem. And there's a whole host of reasons that I'm sure we're going to get into on why just buying a new piece of tech, whether it's shiny or not shiny, and installing it isn't going to actually reduce cyber risk for your organization. And one thing that I'd really like leaders to take, and this is why I want to start with this point, leaders to take away is that oftentimes you might actually already have controls in your environment and solutions in your environment that already address reducing the risk and introducing the controls that technology that you're trying to buy would actually address already. Like a common example, right? You might have some like EDR solution already in place. Maybe you are a Microsoft Office 365 shop and you've got Defender already introduced into your environment, but then you purchase some type of Cisco platform and it comes with their EDR solution. Now you have two solutions. Maybe you paid a little bit extra to get that additional bundle. But really, if you look against, like a MITRE ATT&CK framework or look at what your risk profile is and what your controls are to that risk, you're actually not getting any additional cyber risk reduction. You're getting duplicative controls. And unfortunately, you're paying for that. And then you're going to have to either, unwind that, or in a lot of instances, you'll be wrapped into like a multi-year contract. And then you'll have to wait until those things expire before you can get out with any type of penalty.
So there are definitely, it seems like, some factors within our control when it comes to spending money on new technology for a company. But what about risks that we can't necessarily control that might affect our budget or the success of a program?
Yeah, so we see this oftentimes, and unfortunately, I see a lot of newer, CISOs or people who are, new into the position make this mistake more often. And it's basically when you're looking at a solution, like whatever the solution is that's going to solve your cyber risk problem. Oftentimes the vendor or the VAR in between will say, this firewall, for example, right, costs $35,000, but it's going to solve all your problems. It's next gen, single pane of glass, like introduce buzzword here, right? I guess the new one would be like, it's got AI enabled, whatever. Right. So 35 grand, I'm looking at my budget. I'm like, well, that's a pretty big piece of my budget, but 35 grand to solve my network risks, good to go. And so you purchase it. But then the problem is you don't account for how long does it take to integrate it into your environment? Do you have to do any type of exploratory research to see what your current, situation is with your network controls, existing firewalls? Maybe you have different sites that you have to account for. Maybe it's just the internal structure. But what does it look like when you introduce this technology? Because you're basically changing a major piece of configuration of your IT ecosystem. So that there's piece of work that has to be done before you even, stroke the check and get the delivery. Then there's the rack and stack. Obviously, there's a bit of manual piece and time that goes into that. And then most importantly, and this is where people fail, in my opinion, most often, is yes, you've purchased it, it's good to go, it's in place, check the box, compliance wins, everybody wins, you're reporting to the board that you got this new shiny bauble that's going to solve all your problems. But then on day two, who's maintaining that? Who's looking at the logs? Who's care and feeding for it, right? And if you have a staff, right, say you have like 3 IT people and you're like, oh, just Carl's going to take care of that. Well, does Carl have the bandwidth? And if not, then what's going to come off Carl's plate, right? There's downstream impacts that you aren't thinking of. And, oh, by the way, is Carl even qualified? And not to say that Carl's not a good person, but like, is is Carl or whoever your engineers are that are going to be managing this, are they trained on that technology? Have you just purchased a tech stack that, yes, they do firewalls, but maybe you were always doing Palo Altos and now you've moved over to like, a Cisco or Fortinet or something. And yes, there are similarities and opportunities to leverage existing knowledge, but it could be a whole new interface with a different language, right? So you'll now have to pay to send Carl to training, right? Did you have budget for the training? Did you have budget for that additional care and feeding? Did you have budget for maintenance patches? Are you even qualified or allowed in some instances to actually maintain that device? Some vendors will actually prevent you from doing maintenance on the system itself in order to maintain the integrity of the system. But what that actually equates to is a recurring maintenance contract with the vendor in order to maintain that. These are all hidden costs, both financial costs, so it's very obvious line item things, as well as kind of operational procedural costs on you executing your other projects. So just stroking a check and hitting that easy button and buying something, yeah, it looks good in the moment, but if you don't take a macro level picture view of what implementation looks like, then you're going to be setting yourself up for failure. And oh, by the way, let's not forget, and I know it's way down the road, but like the decommissioning process, right? If you're replacing a tech, like how are you going to remove the existing tech that you're replacing? What's that look like? And are you going to do it well? A lot of people get all geeked up and ready to implement something. A lot of people don't think about decommissioning and sunsetting those things, which just, if you don't do it, increases your overall exposure, your attack surface, your risk exposure. And frankly, if people forget about it, now you start to have unmanaged infrastructure, which further increases your attack surface.
Yeah, there are definitely quite a few things to consider when you're talking about purchasing new tech and making that investment. One thing you said that stood out to me, you talked about like different buzzwords that you'll see appear, whether that's, maybe right now AI. That stood out to me in particular because I do see that used a lot. Oh, it's got GPT, it's AI enabled. But I noticed it with a lot of these AI tools. They're great, and then you realize there's all these things that are wrong with them. They're not quite what you think that they are, and they're going to require a lot of work, and they got to work out all the bugs. So would you say there's a risk, too, in trying to implement that kind of tech specifically too quickly when it ends up being that later on, oh, there's things that come out, this AI is maybe not what we thought it was?
Yeah, that is a really interesting risk, Sophie. And whenever you're adopting like emerging technology, and unfortunately, the sales side of the security product market wants to push the emerging tech because everybody wants to be like riding the wave of like whatever the coolest next new thing is. But I mean, this almost kind of gets a little bit into, supply chain concerns as well. When you introduce that tech, is it, like how is it being implemented? How are they, besides the sales stuff and the buzzwords and all that, like what is actually happening? Is your data going off of their platform into a third party platform that you don't even have any awareness of? What are the terms and conditions of that? Like really, the tech side of it, yes, that's interesting. But when you are beginning to get into a relationship with a vendor, for lack of a better term, you're going to buy their product and stuff. Again, a lot of people only think of like the easy button of going to buy something like you're buying a blender or like you're buying a car or something like that. But when you're buying a security tech stack and you're putting it in your environment, you're making a lot of commitments and you're entangling yourself a lot to that stack and that product and that vendor and who they do relationships with as well. So we see this happen quite a lot in the industry with, especially right now, and this cybersecurity framework even thought it was so important to introduce supply chain risk into the cybersecurity framework in their version 1.1 or 1.2 because it was so important. Who are they doing relationships with, and what is the relationship with your data and those third parties that are handling that data? Because like you said, we've seen multiple instances where people are putting private data into ChatGPT and finding out that they don't have any assurances that that data is going to be protected. Famously, Samsung put in a bunch of intellectual property and engineering type stuff into ChatGPT in order to get some information. That got kind of exposed. We've seen healthcare people put PHI into ChatGPT and that gets exposed. So your business's data could be exposed. So it's just something when you're courting the vendors, when you're talking with the sales, inside sales, etc. These are concerns that you should actually raise. Not just how many lights does it have that blink and what can it do on the surface to protect my data, but also what are the downstream kind of not roots, but the downstream kind of tentacles of what this solution is and who it interfaces with. Definitely a good point, Sophie, to bring up on something to give consideration for when you're making these kind of macro level evaluations of purchasing.
You also brought up vendors, how you might have a relationship with a vendor and tend to purchase from them. Do you have any tips or advice you could share on maybe vendor or product selection?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm always a fan. Again, for me personally, in my career and my experience, I choose the hard path, not because I like, I'm like a sadomasochist and want it to be harder, but for me, I'm objective, I'm structured, I'm programmatic in my approach, and when I make a decision, I know that all the work I've done behind me is solid and it's a solid foundation that I'm going to build my house on top of. So when I'm looking at product, yes, you could be a Cisco shop or you could be a Microsoft shop or whatever, and that's going to kind of limit what you're necessarily going to do in some instances. But if you're evaluating a tech that is perhaps new to your environment or isn't part of an existing tech stack where it would make sense, I'm always an advocate of minimum 3 solutions. And by the way, you're going to have sales team that you regularly deal with, right? You got a lady named Alice that you absolutely love working with. Alice has been the best, been your friend for years and years and years. That's fine. You can maintain those relationships. But what I would say is when you're going to evaluate a solution, right? Let's take MDR, managed detection and response, for example. You're going to outsource your SecOps capability or you're going to introduce SecOps into your environment, okay? Come up with criteria, right? Before you look at any MDR solutions, and this is a really critical thing because you're going to introduce subjective bias if you don't do this. Before you look at anything, come up either with your team, with the leadership team, with your own InfoSec team, whatever works for you in your situation, but come up with like maybe 5 different pieces of criteria and weight them. Like, what matters to you? Is it price? Is it 24/7? Is it how many people manage it? Is it MDR vendor reputation in your industry or in your space? Like whatever it is that matters to you, document it and then evaluate at least 3 solutions, if not more, maybe 5, 6, 7, depending on how large a percentage of your budget you're talking about spending, right? If you're spending 70% of your budget, you better be really confident on what you're doing. If it's 10%, maybe you just take a flyer and go YOLO. So come up with that criteria and then actually evaluate it objectively as you're going through. You can let the vendors know like what your criteria is. You don't have to like keep a close hand like poker or something, but be honest with yourself because what'll happen, and this is kind of the thing I want you to be concerned with and on the lookout for. If you don't have that objective criteria, what can happen is you could have like really good rapport or the vendor takes you out for a round of golf or something like that. And you get distracted from what is actually important to you and reducing cyber risk for your organization. And you get more into kind of fuzzy subjective criteria of, these 2 products seem really similar and I really liked this guy, or like, I want to work with these people because of whatever. And maybe they cost more, maybe they don't offer those things that were important to you before you got distracted, frankly, by these other kind of elements.
It's interesting because I think that's something that even as a consumer, I'm obviously not making purchasing decisions for a company, but on an individual consumer level, it is important to, if I go looking for a new laptop and I don't know exactly what it is that I want in a laptop, I just know I need something new, I'm very likely to walk in and end up just buying whatever is pushed at me that seems like it has the most selling points if I don't know exactly what it is that I need in a laptop before I go in. So it kind of seems like that translates well from the consumer level to this higher up level of leaders purchasing tech for a company.
Yeah, absolutely. And you've got to remember, like, yes, you're a steward of the organization and their money and stuff like that. But at the end of the day, right, you're given budget, right? Like, so we're assuming this whole conversation, Sophie, has assumed that you've been given budget and now you're making purchasing decisions with that money. At the end of the day, after you make the purchasing decision, yes, you're going to be able to like not coast, but you're going to be able to float for like 3, 6 months, whatever it is, during the implementation of the solution. And you'll be reporting to the board or leadership, oh yeah, we're right on track, we're executing, we're doing whatever. At some point, you're going to have to ask for more budget the next fiscal year, or if there's been some kind of incident or whatever. And when that time comes, a lot of boards are going to say, well, what'd you do with the money we gave you last time? Like, where is the return on our investment? And information security offices are not revenue generators typically. We're cost centers, and a lot of our value comes in preventing things from happening. So the things you never see is what you're paying for, right? That's why when people have incidents, the checkbook gets opened up immediately because the board is like, oh my god, this hurts. We don't want this to hurt again, right? So you have to be prepared. And this is why it's so important to make reasonable, objectively sound decisions that you can defend later based on criteria that someone else reasonably could come to the same conclusion as you based on that criteria. Because when you go back to budget and you need to make these arguments on how you have reduced risk for the organization and how you're being a good steward of the money, right? You're showing the value on these investments. It's critically important. And that's why, again, I use the term foundation, because you need to build on top of a solid foundation. If you're just going, whatever, subjective and like playing rounds of golf and just buying from your buddy who happens to be a VAR, well, then that's a really tough sell if it doesn't work out, right? Maybe it does work out and everything's rosy and you don't run into a situation. But for me, as a information security GRC professional, CISO, like, I don't like risk. I like managing all my risk down to as low a level as possible, right? I like to mitigate down. And for me, having objective, defendable positions and a logical flow of decision making that can be explained and have a reasonable person come to the same conclusion is about as low a mitigated risk as I can possibly get.
So, Gerry, I imagine you've had to make your fair share of purchasing decisions as well. Are there any lessons learned or final thoughts that you can share as far as advice goes?
Yeah, I mean, this is going to sound terrible, but like one really great opportunity to get budget, and I've already kind of laid out how I make my decision makings with purchasing. There's two things that I'd share with this audience right now. One, hopefully you don't have to have an incident. If you do, the checkbook's going to be open and you're going to be off and running. But obviously there's pain of having an incident. Don't be shy to take advantage of another entity's incident, right? Especially if they're aligned in your market. So if you're working in healthcare, there's plenty of examples of healthcare organizations getting hit with ransomware. Maybe you want to introduce tabletop exercises, or you want to introduce immutable backup storage or something like that. Use that example and say, hey, executives or board or, stakeholders, like, this is a similar organization that suffered this incident. Here are the pain points. Here's how it looked. Don't get too technical, right? Just point out that this is a problem, and we don't want that to happen to us, but we are at risk of risk exposure of it happening. Here's how we can prevent it. That's really a great opportunity to get the benefit of suffering an incident without actually having to suffer an incident. Also, like I said, and it's critically important, when you are making a purchasing decision, really give consideration into what that implementation plan would look like. Talk to the vendor, figure out what kind of support you're going to get, and really ask hard questions, right? And with no disrespect to salespeople at all, but salespeople, they're incentivized to make sales, right? So asking hard questions, not to be rude or unprofessional, but asking hard questions to fully understand what that implementation plan is going to look like and how you're going to support it from staff, resources, finances, all of that, it is vitally important. So you have a clear understanding of what you're doing. So when you make that purchasing decision, you're feeling, aces.
Well, Gerry, thank you so much for sharing some of that invaluable information, some of your own experience and advice on making wise purchasing decisions for a company. And thank you all so much for joining us for this conversation. We hope you enjoyed, and we'll catch you next time.